Hey guys! Tonight we're stepping into Imperial China, one of the most complex, disciplined, and majestic civilizations the world has ever known. A place of dynasties rising and falling like tides, of silk that shimmered like captured moonlight, of palaces that seemed carved straight out of heaven itself. You've probably seen the romantic images, golden roofs glinting in the sun, scholars in flowing robes scribbling poetry with brushes finer than feathers, entire armies marching in perfect formation beneath banners that snapped like thunder in the wind. But don't let the postcard fool you. Behind the lantern glow, beneath the painted dragons, Imperial China was magnificently merciless. The same system that built wonders also crushed millions without a second thought. It was splendor, and it was suffering. Before we go further, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy this sort of historical sleep torture. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. I'm always fascinated to see who's curled up in bed at 2 a.m. listening to me mutter about dynasties. Now, dim the lights, maybe pour yourself some tea, let the hum of your fan be the background music, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Welcome to Imperial China. And if you thought you were going to stroll into this world as some kind of free spirit, sorry. Imperial China was built on hierarchy, order, and obedience. Society wasn't a messy pile of people. It was a pyramid, sharp-edged, unshakable. You didn't just live here. You slotted into place, like a brick in a wall. And heaven help you if you tried to shuffle sideways. At the very top, the emperor. Not just a ruler, not just a king, but the Son of Heaven. A living axis between the divine and the human. He held the mandate of heaven, a cosmic permission slip to govern the world. But that mandate was a fickle thing. If floods drowned your village, if earthquakes shattered your home, if locusts stripped the fields bare, people whispered that heaven was displeased, that the emperor had lost his divine right. And when heaven revoked its favor, rebellion erupted like wildfire. Dynasties collapsed, heads rolled, and palaces filled with smoke. The emperor's life was magnificent, yes, but it was magnificently precarious. One bad harvest, and your divine authority was suddenly up for grabs. Beneath him came the scholar officials, the mandarins, the bureaucratic aristocracy. These were men who clawed their way into power not by birth or bloodshed, but by suffering through the eternal nightmare of the imperial exams. Imagine memorizing entire libraries of Confucian classics, word for word, while your hand cramped from endless copying. Then lock yourself in a coffin-sized cell for days, scratching out essays on morality while trying not to faint from hunger, heat, or despair. If you passed, you became a mandarin, gliding through halls in silk robes, wielding authority like a blade dipped in ink. You could govern provinces, oversee taxes, write poetry about plum blossoms while peasants bowed before you. If you failed, and most did, you trudged home in shame, your family disappointed, your neighbors smirking, your future collapsing like a paper lantern in the rain. And beneath the mandarins, the farmers. Confucian philosophy adored them. They fed the empire after all. Without them, no rice, no taxes, no silk threads to weave. In theory, they were respected, praised as the moral backbone of society. In reality, their days were a muddy blur of sweat, sun, and endless bending. Backs broken under the weight of harvests, hands blistered from tilling, eyes straining at the horizon praying for rain or mercy. Respected? Respected the way we respect oxygen, necessary, invisible, and taken completely for granted. Next came the artisans, the craftsmen, the potters, the weavers, the metalworkers. They carved jade into dragons so delicate it seemed the stone might breathe, cast bronze that gleamed like captured fire, wove silk into robes fit for emperors. Their skill filled temples and palaces, their artistry traveled along trade routes to distant lands. And yet, society placed them firmly beneath the farmers. Skilled hands, clever minds, perhaps, but not the moral backbone, not the righteous heart. You could make something immortal out of clay, and still, the man who memorized Confucius outranked you by galaxies. And then, the merchants. Ah, merchants. Here's where irony bites hard. Merchants were often rich, sometimes obscenely so. They imported exotic goods, stocked their homes with lacquer and porcelain, filled their tables with foods most peasants never dreamed of tasting. Their sons wore silk, their wives glittered with jewelry. But respect? None. Confucian doctrine saw them as parasites, feeding off the labor of others, moving goods around but producing nothing. Farmers made food, artisans made objects, merchants just profited. So society treated them like tax-evading raccoons dressed in brocade. Well, yes, but whispered about, distrusted, snubbed at every ritual. The richer you were, the more people narrowed their eyes at you. But the pyramid didn't end there. Below even the merchants, there were the basement classes. Soldiers, actors, entertainers, prostitutes. Necessary but morally tainted. Soldiers were needed in war, but distrusted in peace, seen as brutes who reeked of blood and drank too much. Actors could make you laugh or cry, but were considered little more than painted shadows. And prostitutes? Society pretended to clutch its pearls, yet the brothels never closed. And then, outside the pyramid altogether, women. Technically present, practically invisible. Confucian ideals painted women as obedient shadows, orbiting men like moons around planets. Your worth was measured not in your thoughts or your talents, but in your father, your husband, your sons. Marry well, and perhaps you lived comfortably behind painted screens. Marry poorly, and you labored until your bones ached. Foot binding twisted your body into symbols of beauty and submission, bones broken and reshaped, pain wrapped in embroidered shoes. Beauty is pain, yes. But here, pain was law. Women weren't on the chart, because they weren't considered part of the social backbone at all. They were more like accessories. Indispensable, but unacknowledged. So what did all this mean for you? It meant that from the moment you were born, your fate was stamped, sealed, and filed away in heaven's bureaucracy. A farmer's child grew into a farmer's backbreaking life. A merchant's child inherited suspicion. A woman inherited silence. Mobility existed, yes, but the latter was slippery, greased with failure and humiliation. And if you thought you could just climb out of your lane, society smiled sweetly and whispered, "That's adorable. Now get back to work." In Imperial China, order wasn't just encouraged, it was enforced with the weight of heaven itself. Your bow wasn't just a gesture of respect, it was your survival. Your rank wasn't just status, it was your identity. You weren't an individual. You were a grain of rice in the imperial bowl. Easy to swallow, easy to replace. And so begins your day in this shimmering empire of splendor and suffering, where dragons curled across palace walls stared down at you with unblinking eyes, reminding you that heaven's order was written above you, and that stepping outside of it wasn't rebellion, it was blasphemy. Your day in Imperial China begins, not with sunlight, not with roosters, not even with hunger gnawing at your stomach. It begins with hierarchy pressing down on you like a heavy quilt you can't kick off. The moment your eyes open, you bow. Not once, not twice, but to everything that matters, to your parents, to your ancestors, to the invisible weight of Confucius himself, whose ghost seemed to hover in every corner of your home. There is no good morning, no sleepy, how'd you sleep? No small talk, just ritual. You bow when you wake, you bow before you eat, you bow before you leave the house. And forget once? Forget to show proper filial piety? Congratulations, you've committed one of the gravest sins possible. Unfilial children weren't just considered rude, they were considered dangerous, like termites gnawing at the beams of society. Punishments ranged from beatings, to exile, to shame that clung to your family like smoke. And the hierarchy inside the home hummed like background music you couldn't turn off. Father over son. Husband over wife. Elder brother over younger brother. Everyone had their place, everyone knew their place, and stepping out of line was not quirky, it was catastrophic. Imagine living in a world where the single most important virtue wasn't love, or kindness, or honesty, it was obedience. Obedience dressed up as respect. Confucius didn't care how you felt. He cared how low you could bend without breaking. So, after all the bowing, you shuffle into the morning meal. Breakfast, if you could call it that. Don't expect fried eggs, or sizzling bacon, or fluffy buns dripping with butter. Expect a thin, steaming bowl of congee. Rice gruel. Watery, bland, sliding down your throat like liquid wallpaper paste. Sometimes a pickle, maybe a vegetable scrap. Occasionally, if the gods were generous, a tiny sliver of meat. But mostly, it was survival, spooned into your mouth one lukewarm gulp at a time. And silence. Silence was law at the table. You didn't joke, you didn't gossip, you didn't daydream aloud. You sat facing the ancestral shrine, carved tablets staring down at you like stern auditors of your appetite. Every bite was a reminder, your life was not your own. It belonged to the dead who came before you, and to the empire that taxed the very grain you ate. Breakfast wasn't a pleasure, it was ritual fuel. The calories you needed to bow some more, to work some more, to endure some more. And then came clothing, though really, there wasn't much choice involved. The empire dictated what you could wear, right down to color and fabric. If you were a farmer, you pulled on coarse hemp or rough cotton, scratchy as sandpaper, dyed in earth tones as dull as the fields you worked in. Artisans and slightly better off folks might afford brighter dyes, a splash of blue or red, but never too bold, never too rich. Silk was for the elite. And yellow silk, the sacred shade of the emperor, was so exclusive that wearing it without permission was practically volunteering for execution. Men's robes were long, belted, layered. They swished as you walked, not for comfort but for signaling your place in the order. Fashion wasn't expression here, it was a uniform, a stitched reminder of where you stood and how far you would never rise. Women faced something darker, the cruel ballet of foot binding. Little girls, barely old enough to play, had their feet crushed and bound, bones broken and bent inward until the arch folded like paper. Beauty, they said. Delicacy, they said. But really, it was mutilation disguised as elegance. The pain was constant, the infections frequent, the smell unforgettable. And yet, those tiny, misshapen feet in embroidered shoes were tickets to marriage, to status, to a future slightly less grim. Beauty is pain, we say today. In Imperial China, pain was mandatory. So, dressed and aching, you step into the real heart of the day, work. Because here's the truth. The empire wasn't built on porcelain and poetry. It was built on sweat. Endless, thankless sweat. If you were a farmer, your day stretched as long as the sun itself. Plowing with oxen that stumbled through the mud, planting seedlings with your bare hands, hauling water, harvesting under skies that burned your skin or froze your bones. Famine was a constant shadow. One bad harvest, and your family starved. And even if the harvest was good, the state took its share, leaving you just enough to scrape by. Respected, in theory, exploited in reality. Your back was the empire's backbone, but no one stopped to ask if it hurt. If you were a woman, your work doubled. Housework wasn't optional. Cooking, weaving, raising children, bowing to in-laws, preparing offerings, fetching water. And then, when the chores ended, the fieldwork began. Spinning thread until your fingers bled, weaving cloth, feeding pigs, threshing grain. Women didn't rest. They just shifted from one type of labor to another, like bees moving between flowers that offered no nectar. Artisans spent long hours at their craft. Hammering, shaping, carving, firing. Your work could end up in the emperor's palace, or on a trader's cart heading west. But your name? Forgotten. Your skill praised, but your life ignored. Merchants. The irony of their days was thicker than their purses. They wheeled and dealt, haggled, stored goods, tracked shipments, counted coins. Wealth piled up, but respect? None. You were sneered at, distrusted, treated as a parasite. Society spat on you while secretly craving your wares. And if you were drafted into corvée labor, congratulations, your job might be building a wall, digging a canal, hauling stones for a monument that would never bear your name. Corvée labor was free labor, demanded by the state. No wages, no choice, no sympathy. The empire needed roads, dams, fortifications, and you were the tool. So, from dawn to dusk, life was labor. Endless, cyclical, grinding. And when the sun finally slipped below the horizon, you staggered home, not to rest, but to repeat the cycle of bows, meals, silence, and obedience. Work did not set you free here. Work chained you, body and soul, to the machinery of an empire that saw you not as a person, but as a grain of rice in its bowl, easily consumed, easily replaced. If you were unlucky enough to be born with ambition in Imperial China, you had one narrow ladder to climb, and that ladder was made of paper. The civil service exams. 3 words that promised glory, but usually delivered exhaustion, humiliation, and in many cases, death. The exam halls were prisons in disguise. Rows of tiny cubicles, each the size of a coffin standing upright, where candidates sat for days at a time, scribbling with frozen fingers or sweaty palms, depending on the season. Food was rationed. Toilets were buckets. Disease spread as quickly as ink stains. And the task? To recite Confucian classics word for word, then write essays on morality, governance, and the proper way to rule a household, a district, an empire. Thousands entered. Almost all failed. Imagine spending your entire youth memorizing texts so long and dry they made the desert jealous, only to collapse during the test, or worse, to pass and then discover that hundreds of others had also passed, and there were far fewer positions than promises. Failure wasn't just personal shame. It dragged your family down too. Decades of effort, wasted. Success, on the other hand, could launch you into the scholar official class. A new robe, a new rank, and the authority to lecture others about virtues you barely had time to practice. And hygiene? Well, let's be generous and call it selective. Bathing was not a daily pleasure. Water was precious, and for many, soap was non-existent. Peasants rinsed with river water when they could, scrubbing with sand or ash, hoping the current carried away more dirt than it brought. Elites had baths, yes, sometimes scented with attendants to pour hot water, but even then, the idea of washing every day was absurd. Too much bathing, they believed, weakened the body. So they kept cleanish, or at least perfumed. Toilets were simple pits, shared, unprivate, buzzing with flies. Chamber pots, carried and emptied by the unlucky, added their own perfume to city streets. In rural areas, fertilizer didn't come in neat bags. Human waste was collected and spread across fields, recycling with ruthless efficiency. The stench of survival rising from every furrow. No toothbrushes, no floss. Maybe a twig to chew on, maybe herbal rinses if you were lucky. Bad breath wasn't a flaw, it was the national anthem. Law and justice were no cleaner. The emperor was the son of heaven, but he ruled through law codes as rigid as stone tablets. Justice here wasn't blind, it was obsessed with hierarchy. Punishments were scaled not by the crime alone, but by who you were and who you offended. Strike your father? Unthinkable. The punishment was brutal. Strike your son? Less serious. Crimes against superiors carried far heavier weight than crimes against those beneath you. Punishments were creative. Beatings with bamboo rods, public humiliation, exile to remote and barren regions. And then, of course, the death penalty, carried out in ways meant not only to kill, but to terrify. The infamous death by 1,000 cuts was reserved for the worst offenders, rebels, traitors, those who dared to question the throne. And here's the irony. While Confucian philosophy emphasized harmony, morality, and filial devotion, the legal system was steeped in fear. Fear kept people in line more effectively than virtue ever could. So, your day in Imperial China was framed by rules. Rules in the home. Rules in clothing. Rules in exams. Rules in how you washed, how you ate, how you worked, how you obeyed. It was a society that polished obedience like jade, carved hierarchy into every gesture, and demanded that you accept your station with bowed head and steady hands. And yet, people endured. They laughed in secret. They found moments of softness, of song, of tea shared beneath lantern light. Humanity always finds cracks in the walls built around it. But make no mistake, life in Imperial China was less about living and more about surviving the weight of heaven's order pressing down on your shoulders. And now we shift from laws and punishments to something a little tastier, though not necessarily more cheerful: food, festivals, and entertainment in Imperial China. You might think this is the fun section, the colorful lanterns, the dragon dances, the steaming bowls of noodles. And yes, those existed. But remember, the empire was a place of splendor and starvation living side by side, often in the same street. Your breakfast, if you were a peasant, was still the same watery congee. Maybe with a pinch of salt, maybe not. Vegetables if the season allowed, pickled radish if you were lucky. That was a rumor, a story told by travelers, a dream whispered by children. Only festivals brought real feasts for the common folk, and even then, scraps were precious. The elite, of course, dined like miniature emperors. Banquets stretched on for hours. Roasted duck glistening with fat, fish swimming in sauces, delicate dumplings folded like works of art, fruits carried from distant provinces just to prove you could afford them. Wine and poetry flowed hand in hand, until the line between philosophy and drunken rambling blurred. But food wasn't just nourishment. It was politics, symbolism, ritual. Rice itself was sacred, the backbone of survival. Tea, elevated into art, became a meditation in a cup. And then there was the imperial kitchen, an army of cooks tasked with not only feeding the son of heaven, but ensuring that each meal was balanced according to yin and yang, the cosmic order baked directly into the emperor's stomach. Festivals gave everyone, rich and poor, a reason to pause. New Year celebrations turned cities into seas of firecrackers and red paper, scaring away demons with smoke and sound. Lantern festivals lit up the night, fragile orbs drifting like glowing prayers. Dragon boat races churned rivers into foam. And behind the beauty? Endless preparation, the labor of countless hands sewing, carving, cooking, and cleaning, so that a fleeting moment of splendor could exist before vanishing again. Entertainment, meanwhile, was not Netflix. It was theater troupes performing in marketplaces, masked actors retelling ancient stories with exaggerated gestures. Shadow puppetry, flickering against silk screens, made myths dance in firelight. Acrobats bent and flipped in ways that made spines ache just to watch. Music filled the air, the pluck of the pipa, the haunting sigh of the flute, drums that echoed like distant thunder. Gambling was another favorite pastime, especially among those who couldn't afford to lose. Dice, cards, betting on cricket fights. Yes, crickets. Tiny, chirping insects turned into gladiators, cheered on by crowds who staked their meager earnings on which bug had the better bite. Desperation finds strange outlets. And then, of course, there were less wholesome amusements. Brothels, hidden behind painted doors, catered to every level of society, from farmers with a few copper coins to officials with entire purses of silver. Pleasure districts were policed and taxed, tolerated as long as they stayed discreet, yet they thrived, because repression always breeds demand. But for all the spectacle, the empire's entertainments were never free of hierarchy. The emperor had operas performed at his whim, entire troops trained to please his gaze. Peasants gathered around storytellers in tea houses, where tales of ghosts and warriors blurred the line between history and myth. Both groups laughed, cried, and gasped, but from very different seats in the theater of life. So yes, there was beauty. Yes, there was color. But beneath every celebration was the reminder of order, of who feasted and who starved, of who danced in silk robes and who swept the floors afterwards. Imperial China could throw a festival like no other, but when the lanterns went out, the darkness returned just as quickly. If you thought exams and punishments were rough, wait until you hear about romance. Because in this world, love wasn't a choice, it was an assignment, carefully arranged by families, sealed with contracts, and weighed with dowries heavier than actual affection. Marriage began not with a spark in the eyes, but with a matchmaker's ledger. Parents chose, horoscopes were compared, birth charts aligned. If the stars said yes, your fate was sealed. You, at 16, might be told you were marrying a man twice your age, or a girl you'd never even met until the wedding day. Romance novels? Those were fantasies, and dangerous ones at that. Dowries were the true heartbeat of the ceremony: money, land, textiles, servants, livestock. A woman's value was measured in what she brought into the union, not in who she was. For men, it was about securing alliances, strengthening clans, ensuring heirs. For women, it was about survival. And once inside the household, the hierarchy didn't end. Wives bowed to husbands, concubines bowed to wives, servants bowed to everyone. Men could divorce under the infamous 7 outs, fail to produce a son, gossip too much, disobey in-laws, or simply get sick, and you could be sent back to your parents' home in disgrace. Women, however, could not initiate divorce, unless the husband tried to kill them. Small mercy. Concubinage was its own universe. Men of wealth could keep multiple women, each competing for favor, each measured by the sons they bore. Jealousy, intrigue, whispered poisonings. The household could feel like a miniature palace, dripping with suspicion. Women were rivals in their own cage, often forced into cruelty by the structure itself. And children, they weren't spared either. Sons were treasured, raised to carry the family name, drilled in duty from the moment they could walk. Daughters were taught obedience, quietness, and how to make themselves desirable to another family. Filial piety wasn't just a suggestion, it was law. To defy your parents was unthinkable, a stain on your soul that could bring punishment from the state itself. Gender roles were sharp as a blade. Men carried the family's public honor, women carried its private burdens. Beauty itself became a form of bondage. Foot binding, practiced among the elite, forced young girls to endure years of agony, their feet broken and reshaped into tiny, perfect lotus blossoms. A grotesque standard of elegance, leaving women crippled, yet celebrated. Beauty is pain, yes. But here, pain was mandatory. And yet, within this rigid structure, there were moments of tenderness. Families did share joy, festivals with children running wild, grandparents telling stories, small kindnesses hidden beneath duty's weight. Humanity finds cracks even in stone walls. But make no mistake, in Imperial China, your gender decided your script, and there was no rewriting it. Rebellion, surveillance, and the ever-present fear of the state in Imperial China, buckle in, because if the exams were suffocating and marriage was a gilded cage, rebellion was the fire escape that always collapsed under your feet. Rebellion sounds noble, doesn't it? Banners waving, farmers with pitchforks marching, the promise of change carried on desperate shouts. But in Imperial China, rebellion was rarely glorious. It was bloody, chaotic, and almost always doomed. Because the state was not just big, it was enormous. The emperor commanded not just armies, but the mandate of heaven itself. To rise against him wasn't just treason, it was blasphemy. Peasants, ground down by taxes, famine, or endless labor, often snapped. Villages would gather in secret, whispering under lantern light, planning to overthrow local magistrates. Sometimes they succeeded briefly. They would storm a granary, seize weapons, maybe even carve out a small kingdom for a few months. And then the hammer fell. Imperial troops would arrive, disciplined, armored, merciless. Villages were burned. Rebels were executed in ways so creative you almost had to admire the bureaucracy behind them. Death by slicing, thousands of cuts, drawn out over hours. Or maybe execution of 3 generations. Not just you, but your parents, your children, even distant cousins, all erased so your name could rot in silence. Rebellion wasn't just dangerous, it was contagious. The state treated it like a plague, stomping it out with brutal efficiency. And to make sure rebellion never even had the chance to grow, surveillance was everywhere. The walls have ears, they said, and they meant it. Eunuchs, those palace officials with their loyalty surgically guaranteed, served as the emperor's informants. They spied on nobles, generals, even other eunuchs. In villages, local headmen kept watch, reporting suspicious gatherings or unfilial children. Neighbors turned on neighbors, sometimes out of loyalty, sometimes out of fear, often just to settle a grudge. Imagine living in a world where a careless joke about the emperor could mean exile. A complaint muttered at a wine shop might travel faster than the wind, straight into a magistrate's report. The emperor himself didn't need to see you. His network of eyes and ears saw everything. And it wasn't just official spies. The family itself was weaponized. Sons were expected to police fathers, wives to monitor husbands, students to report teachers. Loyalty to the emperor outweighed loyalty to blood. Betrayals happened not in shadows, but across dinner tables. Trust was fragile, thin as rice paper. So, rebellion was rare, surveillance constant, and the punishment for stepping out of line was merciless. Does that mean people always obeyed? Not exactly. Humans are stubborn. Secret societies grew, cloaked in religious robes, preaching salvation and justice. White Lotus sects, Taoist cults, Buddhist brotherhoods, they offered hope, sometimes rebellion disguised as ritual. They dreamed of overturning dynasties, claiming the mandate of heaven for themselves. And sometimes they actually succeeded, if only for a season. Dynasties did fall after all. History itself is a string of rebellions that worked, until they didn't. But for the ordinary person, rebellion was not a noble cause. It was a gamble with odds so bad, Vegas wouldn't touch them. Survival usually meant obedience. Bow, nod, keep your head down, and live to see another spring. Resist, and you wouldn't just die, you'd vanish. Your body torn apart, your family erased, your village a pile of ash. This was the paradox of Imperial China. So magnificent in scale, so disciplined in design, yet held together by fear that seeped into every crack of daily life. You weren't just a subject of the emperor, you were property of the state, watched, weighed, and judged at every step. And yet, even in this world of watchers and punishers, people still whispered dreams. They still lit incense to forgotten gods, still hoped for justice, still imagined a future where the hierarchy cracked. Rebellion was dangerous, surveillance suffocating, punishment merciless, but the human heart? It keeps beating. And sometimes, that was rebellion enough. Step past the red gates of the Forbidden City, and you're not just walking into a palace, you're walking into the most dangerous workplace in the world. It glittered with gold, lacquer, and marble, but beneath the surface it was a nest of whispers, knives hidden in sleeves, and ambitions sharper than any sword. The emperor, son of heaven, master of 10,000 things, but also the most isolated man alive. Every step of his day was choreographed. He woke surrounded by eunuchs, officials, and attendants. Meals were tasted for poison. Clothing was laid out according to the calendar and the heavens. Even his sleep was regulated, with concubines assigned by Rhoda, chosen not by his whims but by bureaucratic order. Romance? That didn't exist here. The emperor's body was not his own, it was the empire's. And yet, for all his majesty, the emperor was also trapped. One wrong move, one misjudged alliance, and the dynasty could slip. History was littered with sons of heaven who were little more than puppets, controlled by eunuchs, dowager empresses, or domineering ministers. Absolute power sounds impressive, until you realize everyone around you is sharpening daggers behind silken curtains. Eunuchs, the infamous eunuchs. Men cut off from their bloodlines, reshaped into creatures of loyalty, or at least, that was the theory. In practice, eunuchs wielded enormous influence. They controlled access to the emperor, and in a palace where seeing the emperor was everything, that meant they controlled politics itself. Some became kingmakers, others hoarders of wealth, a few, tyrants in all but name. Loved, hated, feared, often all at once. Then came the imperial harem. Concubines and consorts, ranked in dizzying hierarchies, each vying for the emperor's gaze. One night of favor could elevate a woman's clan to riches, one slip could doom them to disgrace. Behind painted smiles, the harem was a battlefield. Alliances formed and dissolved, poison found its way into teacups, silk sleeves hid blades of every kind. Some women wrote poetry, some plotted coups, some simply endured. But every single one lived in a cage gilded so brightly it blinded the world outside. And court officials, scholar bureaucrats in their stiff robes, quoting Confucius, bowing until their backs ached. They spoke of harmony and virtue, while maneuvering like chess masters for power. A single memorial to the throne could end a rival's career. Words themselves were weapons. Say the wrong thing? Your tongue might be cut out. Say the right thing at the wrong time? You might still end up exiled. Loyalty was demanded, but suspicion was constant. Poetry, believe it or not, was political. Emperors judged officials not just on their edicts, but on their verses. A clumsy metaphor could sink a career. A subtle critique hidden in a poem could be enough to earn a flogging. Literature was both armor and executioner's blade. Imagine writing a haiku and realizing it could cost you your head. And succession, the eternal storm. The emperor had many sons, many wives, many concubines, too many. Who would inherit? Factions formed behind each possible heir, mothers scheming for their sons, eunuchs aligning with favorites. When an emperor died, the palace often turned into a battlefield without arrows. Sometimes poison decided the victor. Sometimes steel. Sometimes sheer luck. For the people outside the gates, the Forbidden City was a symbol of order, heaven on earth. Inside, it was chaos wrapped in ritual. The ceremonies, the bowing, the layers of silk, all designed to mask the truth that every heartbeat in that place carried risk. To live at court was to live on stage. Every gesture, every glance, every word was performance. Actors who stumbled did not just lose applause, they lost their lives. And the emperor himself? Often the loneliest actor of all, applauded by millions, but unsure who, if anyone, truly cared for the man beneath the dragon robe. So yes, the Forbidden City glittered. Yes, it was magnificent. But it was also a cage, a labyrinth, a theater where power danced hand in hand with death. And if you imagine yourself striding proudly through its halls, pause. Because chances are, you wouldn't survive long enough to see the curtain fall. Let's step away from the palace, the jeweled robes, the trembling courtiers, and look at you, the ordinary person. Because in this empire of millions of armies, canals, pagodas, and palaces, your name mattered about as much as a droplet in the Yellow River. You were not you. You were a unit. A back bent for planting, a hand that carried bricks, a mouth that ate grain. Individuality wasn't celebrated, it was a problem. Standing out meant drawing attention, and attention meant scrutiny, and scrutiny never ended well. Better to blend in, to vanish into the crowd, to keep your head bowed and your voice soft. The empire's record keepers knew you, but only as a number. Census takers arrived, scratching your existence into bamboo slips, counting your children, your pigs, your acres of rice. Not because they cared, but because the state demanded taxes, labor, and soldiers. Your identity began and ended with what you owed. Imagine living a life where no one beyond your village would ever know your name. No monuments, no books, no portraits. At best, you might be remembered in a family shrine, your spirit tablet lined up with dozens of others, incense curling around your wooden name like smoke around a dying flame. Philosophy? Poetry? Those belonged to the elites, the exam passers, the scholars. Peasants told stories, sang songs, passed jokes, but these vanished like footprints in dust. Nothing carved in jade, nothing inked on silk. Your creativity existed, but it was invisible to history. Even your body wasn't entirely yours. The state could conscript you, sending you off to dig canals, build walls, or march into war. Corvée labor meant months, sometimes years, away from home, working yourself raw for projects so massive they swallowed generations. Die on the job? Another body filled your space. You were replaceable, disposable, interchangeable. Religion offered some comfort, but even there, individuality dissolved. Buddhism, Taoism, Confucian rites, they focused on harmony, order, karma, ancestors. You weren't encouraged to blaze your own trail. You were encouraged to fit your piece of the puzzle exactly where it belonged, no more, no less. And anonymity wasn't just cultural, it was survival. Those who stood out, rebels, poets with sharp tongues, dreamers who spoke too loudly, often paid with their lives. The empire had little patience for originality that challenged its order. Better to be a grain of rice in the pot than a spark in the hayloft. But anonymity also had its strange comfort. In a world where emperors lived in cages of gold, where officials feared every word, where concubines fought wars behind silken curtains, perhaps obscurity was freedom. In the mud of your field, with your calloused hands, with your neighbors who knew you only as Brother Li or Sister Zhao, you could at least breathe. No spies watched every movement. No poet's duel threatened your tongue. You suffered, yes, but you were also left alone. Still, the weight of the empire pressed on you daily. You were taught to obey, to bow, to accept. Not to dream too big, not to step too far. Because you were a subject of the Son of Heaven, a cog in the vast machine, a grain of rice in the endless bowl. And if you ask yourself, could you survive that? Could you endure being nameless, faceless, forever replaceable? Perhaps. But would you call it living? Or just existing, one silent heartbeat after another, until your name was incense smoke and ash on a wooden tablet? Imperial China gave the world brilliance, gunpowder, paper, porcelain, poetry, but for most of its people, life was small, anonymous, swallowed whole by the grandeur they helped create but never touched. And that's the bitter truth. You wouldn't last a day here, not because the empire would kill you outright, but because it would erase you. And that, perhaps, is a quieter kind of death. And now, without ceremony, without warning, we leave the incense smoke and courtyards of Imperial China, and we step into the raw, open wilderness of 19th century America. The year is 1846, and the story waiting for us is not silk and scrolls, but wagons, oxen, and hunger. Spring, 1846. Independence, Missouri. A place where ambition gathers like thunderclouds. Dozens of families, restless, hopeful, pack their wagons and set their sights west. California, the promised land. Golden fields, rich soil, a future. The Donner Party, named, somewhat unfairly, after one family among many, was part of this great migration. They were ordinary people just like you. Carpenters, farmers, mothers, children. Their wagons weren't symbols of power, but of everything they owned: bedding, tools, sacks of flour, a frying pan or two. They left behind homes, friends, graves. They chased something they could barely imagine: a better life. The route was simple, in theory. Follow the established Oregon Trail westward, then branch south into California. Thousands had done it. Difficult but possible. Yet ambition whispered another idea. A shortcut. A new route, suggested by a man named Lansford Hastings. Hastings Cut Off, he called it. Faster, easier, he promised. All you had to do was trust a man who had never actually tried it himself. The Donner Party trusted him. And with that decision, they stepped quietly, innocently, into one of the darkest chapters in American history. The early days of the journey were almost cheerful. Wagons creaked along prairies, children laughed, oxen plodded. Dust rose with every mile, but spirits were high. Rivers were forded, fires were built, stories shared beneath endless stars. The horizon seemed infinite, the future wide open. But even here, cracks appeared. Wagons broke down. Oxen stumbled. Arguments sparked. Travel was slow and time was precious. Every mile lost in spring was a mile that winter would reclaim. When they reached Fort Bridger in Wyoming, the fork appeared. The main trail, longer, safer, tested. And Hastings Cut Off, shorter, untested, a gamble. The Donner Party chose the gamble. At first, it didn't seem disastrous. The land narrowed, the path roughened. Mountains loomed, desert stretched. But soon the promises unraveled. The cutoff was no shortcut at all. It was a shimmering hell. The Great Salt Lake Desert, a wasteland of blistering sun and endless salt flats. Wagons creaked across blinding white plains. Oxen collapsed, tongues swollen, hooves bleeding. Water was a mirage, food dwindled. Days stretched into torment. Every step felt like a bargain with death. They lost animals, wagons, supplies. What was meant to save time devoured it instead. By the time they staggered out, they were weeks behind schedule. Winter, the real enemy, was no longer far ahead. It was breathing down their necks. And yet they pushed on. What else could they do? The Sierra Nevada mountains waited. Peaks sharp as knives, slopes rising into the sky. Cross them, and California lay just beyond. Fail, and California would remain a dream. They climbed. Snow began to fall, light at first, then relentless. Flakes thickened into curtains, burying paths, swallowing landmarks. Wagons bogged down. Oxen faltered. Fires sputtered in the wet. Every attempt to push forward ended in exhaustion. The Donner Party was trapped. Caught in the high Sierra, the mountains closing around them like jaws. Behind them, deserts. Ahead, snow walls 30 feet deep. Supplies were nearly gone. And winter had only just begun. This was the turning point, the moment when a hopeful journey became a nightmare. Families huddled in makeshift cabins near Donner Lake, others under canvas stretched against the storm. The snow piled higher, food grew scarcer, hunger gnawed. Their children cried through nights that never seemed to end. And as December deepened, reality became unbearable. The Donner Party faced a choice no one should ever face. Wait and starve, or try to leave, to cross the mountains on foot. They chose to try. A small group, later called the Forlorn Hope, bound crude snowshoes, wrapped blankets tighter, kissed their families, and stepped into the blizzard. They walked toward either salvation or something much darker. The snow is deep, the air is thin, and the Donner Party is out of food. Hope is shrinking like the daylight, and now the darkest chapter begins. The group that left the cabins would later be called the Forlorn Hope. 15 souls, wrapped in scraps of cloth and desperation, strapping together makeshift snowshoes from oxbows and rawhide. They carried what little they had, a blanket here, a strip of dried hide there, and they climbed into the Sierra like ghosts leaving the living behind. Each step was agony. Snow so deep it swallowed their legs, cold so sharp it bit straight through the bone. They walked for days. Hunger clawed at them. They chewed on leather, on pine bark, on anything their teeth could soften. Lips cracked, eyes hollowed, bodies faltered. One by one, they collapsed in the snow, and the living had to decide whether to keep walking or to face the truth. Death came. First, quietly. The weak, the sick, the young fell. The living dug shallow snow graves, but snow is not soil. The bodies lay near, covered in white, waiting. Hunger gnawed louder. Bellies cramped. Minds blurred. Prayers turned into whispers that none wanted to finish. Until, finally, someone spoke aloud what everyone feared. They would eat the dead. No one wanted to. But no one wanted to die either. They cut flesh from the frozen bodies, hands trembling, tears streaming, whispering apologies. The meat was tough, cold, human. And yet it kept them alive. One bite after another, survival stripped away everything but instinct. Still, the march was relentless. They pressed on, half alive, fueled by horror and hope. After 33 days, only 7 stumbled into safety. Gaunt, frostbitten, broken, but alive. They had crossed the mountains, carrying not just their bodies, but the burden of what they had done. Back at Donner Lake, those who had stayed fared little better. Snow piled higher than the cabins. Oxen bones were boiled into bitter paste. Hides were scraped clean, roasted into thin, choking meals. Children whimpered, mothers prayed, fathers rationed. The smell of smoke mixed with hunger, with despair. And when death crept into those cabins too, the same choice returned. The same impossible, unbearable choice. To live, they would eat the bodies of those who could no longer live themselves. And so the winter dragged on. Days blurred into endless white. Nights into endless hunger. And what began as a hopeful journey west became a slow unraveling of humanity, mile by mile, bite by bite. By the time rescue parties finally reached them, months later, the Donner Party was a shadow of what it had been. Gaunt figures, haunted eyes, stories whispered and avoided. Some survived, some didn't. All were scarred. The dream of California had turned into a nightmare carved forever into American memory. And the lesson? Ambition, shortcuts, desperation. They can turn hope into horror faster than you think. The mountain does not care, the snow does not relent, and yet, help is coming, step by step, through the very wilderness that has already chewed through dozens of lives. The first rescue party reached Donner Lake in mid-February, 1847. Imagine the scene, gaunt faces peering from behind frozen logs, hollow eyes that had seen too much, the stink of smoke and rot and despair hanging heavy in the air. The rescuers expected suffering, but what they found looked closer to a graveyard that hadn't finished its work. Cabins half buried in snow, the faint sound of children crying, ribs showing through ragged clothes. And whispers, already, of what had kept them alive. The rescuers had little food themselves. They could only take a handful away, promising to return. Families had to choose who went and who stayed. Imagine standing in the doorway, picking which of your children might live today, and which had to wait another month. Some parents pushed their little ones forward, desperate to see them spared. Others pulled them back, unable to let go, gambling on another sunrise. The first group stumbled out, half dead, carried on hope more than strength. But behind them, dozens still waited. The snow kept falling, the food did not return. A second rescue party came weeks later, clawing through ice, forcing their way back to the cabins. What they saw was worse. Some had died since the last visit. Others had survived by, you already know how. The rescuers recorded the smell of boiled hides, of bones cracked open for marrow, of bodies missing flesh. They led more survivors out, but again, not enough. Then came the third relief. And by then, the Donner camp had turned into something close to hell itself. The rescuers found mutilated remains, children huddled beside corpses, people too weak to walk or even beg. One survivor was accused of having deliberately murdered others for food, Louis Keseberg, whose name would be cursed for decades. They found him alive, yes, but surrounded by bones. Finally, a fourth mission pulled out the last survivors in April after 4 months of entrapment. What had begun as nearly 90 travelers was now less than 50 alive. Men, women, children, broken in body and spirit, carried out of the mountains like relics of some terrible warning. Newspapers pounced. Headlines shouted of cannibalism, of savagery, of human beings turned into monsters by hunger. But the truth was quieter, darker, sadder. These weren't villains. These were ordinary families, dreamers chasing California sunshine, who had been handed to winter and forced to do the unthinkable. Some carried the guilt all their lives. Virginia Reed, only 12 at the time, later wrote that she survived by faith and by the grisly meals they all swore never to name aloud. Others rebuilt, farmed, raised children. Some, like James Reed, tried to polish the story to make survival sound like triumph. But the shadow of Donner Lake never left. And for the westward expansion, it became both a caution and a legend. A reminder that ambition without preparation leads not to glory, but to graves. A story told at campfires, in saloons, in hushed voices. What would you have done? Would you have walked into the snow? Would you have eaten? Would you have lived? Because the mountains keep their silence. Only the survivors carry the screams. The snow finally melted, the cabins stood empty, and the mountains returned to silence. But the Donner Party did not vanish with the thaw. Their story walked out of the Sierra strapped to the backs of survivors, carried in their haunted eyes, whispered in their trembling voices. And America was ready to devour it. Newspapers had a feast, not of flesh, but of scandal. The press smelled blood, and they painted the Donner name in lurid ink. Cannibalism in the mountains. Pioneers feast on human flesh. The public read with horror and fascination, each headline sharper than the last. Families who had lost everything were now turned into exhibits, their tragedy a spectacle for strangers sipping coffee by the fire. And at the center of the circus stood one man, Louis Keseberg. By the time rescuers reached him in April, he was alone, gaunt, crouched among gnawed bones. They said he had murdered to eat. They called him the last cannibal of Donner Lake. Keseberg denied it, swore he had only done what necessity demanded. But rumor is a crueler judge than any court. For the rest of his life, he carried the mark. People spat at him in the street, called him a monster. He once sued for slander, and yes, he even won damages, but money does not wash away whispers. Keseberg died with his name forever chained to meat and marrow. The other survivors? They lived, yes, but living is not the same as peace. Virginia Reed, 12 years old when she trudged out of the snow, never forgot. She grew up, married, wrote her memories down, but in every line you can still hear the hunger, the cold, the silent graves. Her letter to her cousin pleaded that faith and God had carried her through, but faith alone did not fill an empty stomach. Behind her polite words sat the knowledge of what she had eaten to stay alive. James Reed, once cast out of the wagon train for killing a man in a quarrel, returned as a rescuer and, strangely, a hero. He rebuilt his reputation in California, spoke with pride of survival. Others followed suit, brushing over the darkest chapters, as if silence could erase them. But silence never lasts. Donner Lake remained a place of whispers. Children were warned with it, behave, or the Donner Party will come for you. Storytellers used it as a parable, ambition, folly, shortcuts, all ending in snow and bones. And pioneers still traveled west, still rolled their wagons into California, but with the story of Donner echoing in their ears. And what does it leave us? Questions. Always questions. What would you have done with your child starving, lips blue, snow piled high outside your door? Would you cut flesh from a friend? A stranger? Would you refuse and die with dignity, or bend and live with shame? The Donner Party forces us into that corner. It strips away comfort, politeness, morality, until you are face to face with the one truth no one likes to admit: survival is not clean. So the Donner Party lingers. Not just as a tragedy, not just as a headline, but as a mirror, showing us the price of desperation, the weight of choice, and the thin, fragile thread that ties humanity to civility. They set out chasing a dream, and found instead the darkest chambers of human endurance. And that, more than the snow, is what froze them in history. The snow drifts fade, the cabins rot, and the whispers of the Donner Party settle back into the trees. But history never stays quiet for long. So let's leave the Sierra behind, brush the frost from our shoulders, and step into a different storm altogether, not of snow, but of power. Silk-draped, incense-scented, blood-stained power. Wu Zetian was not born a queen. She wasn't even born into nobility. Her father was a merchant, wealthy enough to afford her an education, but still standing outside the old aristocracy that clutched at China's throne like ivy on stone. Most girls of her station would have been married off, tucked away, remembered only in genealogies. But Wu was different. She had eyes sharp enough to pierce through court masks, ambition that did not blink, and the patience of a predator waiting in the grass. As a teenager, she entered the palace of Emperor Taizong, not as wife, not as princess, but as concubine, one of many. Think about that. The imperial harem was a universe in itself, thousands of women, each hoping for a glance, a touch, a word that could raise them above obscurity. Wu learned quickly. She observed, she listened. She played the game that so many had lost, and she never forgot a move. Taizong died in 649. Normally, his concubines would have been shipped off to monasteries, shaved heads, chanting sutras until their bones turned to dust. Wu should have vanished there, swallowed by incense smoke. But history doesn't play by the rulebook. Instead, she found her way back to court under Taizong's son, Emperor Gaozong, not as forgotten widow, but as flame rekindled. Her rise was not gentle. She outmaneuvered rivals, some say even eliminated them, and in Imperial China, eliminated rarely meant just showing them the door. Whispers told of strangled infants, poisoned cups, accusations crafted with the elegance of a brushstroke and the cruelty of a blade. True or not, it worked. Gaozong loved her, trusted her, leaned on her. She became his empress, then his partner in ruling, the shadow behind the throne. And when Gaozong's health faltered, Wu stepped into daylight. First as regent, ruling in her sons' names. Then, when those sons disappointed her, or threatened her, she removed them. Exiled, dethroned, erased. The throne itself grew empty, and she filled it. For the first time in China's long history, a woman declared herself emperor. Not empress consort, not dowager, but emperor. She renamed the dynasty, founded the Zhou, justified her rule with Buddhist prophecy, sculpted her own image in stone and scripture. The world gasped, bowed, and obeyed. And yet her power was not soft. Wu wielded secret police like a scalpel, slicing through dissent before it could breathe. Officials vanished, ministers confessed under torture, poetry itself became dangerous if the wrong metaphor caught the wrong ear. Her court glittered, but behind the jade screens, the air was thick with fear. Roads were repaired, fields expanded, exams opened wider to talent instead of bloodlines. The empire's pulse grew stronger under her hand. Even as she silenced rivals, she fed the people, she strengthened the bureaucracy, she carved her mark into history. But time erodes all. By her 70s, her grip trembled. Factions rose, enemies whispered, coups simmered. At last, her ministers forced her to abdicate, handing the throne back to her sons. Wu died soon after, buried not in her own dynasty's tombs, but alongside Gaozong, her name chiseled, her deeds half erased. Yet erasure never truly works. The Tang scribes tried to paint her as usurper, temptress, villain. But the record remains stubborn. Wu Zetian ruled. She commanded. She reshaped the empire in her image, however merciless that image might have been. And history, with its strange humor, remembers her not as a shadow, but as a flame. Wu Zetian sits on the throne now, no longer in shadows, no longer whispering in the ears of emperors. She is the emperor. Silk banners unfurl, drums thunder, courtiers bow lower than they ever have before, and somewhere in the distance you can hear the crack of a brush on parchment, rewriting history in real time. Her reign was a paradox, magnificent and merciless, reforms stitched together with repression, vision hand in hand with violence. Let's start with the brilliance, because it's easier on the stomach before we get to the blood. Wu knew that the old aristocracy despised her. Those proud families of the Tang had ruled for generations, and they looked at her, daughter of a merchant, former concubine, a woman, and saw nothing but insult. So she weakened them. By opening doors the elite had slammed shut. The imperial examinations, that eternal torture chamber of essays on Confucius and policy, expanded under her. Suddenly, men of humble origin had a chance, if they had the brains and endurance to survive the ink-stained ordeal. This did two things. It filled the government with fresh talent, and it bound that talent's loyalty to her. After all, she had given them their lives. She encouraged agriculture, knowing that hungry peasants are dangerous peasants. Irrigation projects expanded, land distribution policies adjusted, grain stores reinforced. She sent out inspectors to crack down on corruption, even among her allies. To the common folk, Wu's reign could feel like stability, even prosperity. The fields produced, the roads buzzed, Buddhist monasteries flourished under her patronage. Temples rose, sutras carved in stone, all proclaiming her as the divine ruler, the one chosen by destiny. But every temple bell that rang also muffled a scream, because Wu's empire was held together not just by faith and harvests, but by fear. Her secret police became infamous. They prowled the court, the provinces, the villages, sniffing out dissent like wolves. Rumors alone could condemn you. A poem with the wrong metaphor, a toast spoken too carelessly, suddenly you might find yourself dragged into a dark chamber, bamboo rods waiting. Confessions came quickly when your fingers were crushed, when spikes pressed against your body, when the threat of execution loomed over your children too. Wu didn't just eliminate enemies. She erased them. Entire families could vanish, names struck from records, portraits burned. She mastered the art of political silence, not just killing a rival, but making it as though they had never been. Power, after all, is not just about living. It's about being remembered. Yet she wasn't reckless. Wu wielded terror like a scalpel, not a hammer. Yes, blood ran, but she chose carefully, keeping her rivals cowed without collapsing the system she was building. She rewarded loyalty as lavishly as she punished betrayal. Those who served well could rise higher than ever before: generals, scholars, monks. Her court glittered with pageantry. Poets recited verses that had to balance beauty with survival. Musicians played for audiences holding their breath. Eunuchs schemed in corridors, concubines danced on knife edges, ministers drafted memorials with trembling hands. The forbidden city of her day was a theater of loyalty and fear, where every bow could be salvation or damnation. And let's not forget the scandalous moments. She took lovers openly, younger men who fluttered around her like moths to a flame. The Zhang brothers, famous for their charm, found themselves elevated, showered with favors, until they overstepped. Then they found themselves dead. Wu could indulge, yes, but she never surrendered control. As years passed, her legitimacy grew. The empire functioned. The fields fed the people. Bandits were suppressed, borders guarded. What began as shock, a woman on the throne, became, for many, simply life. But nothing lasts forever. Age crept in. Her iron grip weakened. The same aristocrats she had once humbled began to whisper again, sensing an opening. Her sons, the same boys she had sidelined, now returned as men with their own ambitions. The air grew heavy with plots. Wu tried to hold on. She tightened the ropes, leaned on her lovers, silenced new dissent. But the cycle of fear always eats itself. Eventually, even those closest to her wanted change. In 705, a coup forced her to abdicate. Too old to fight, too frail to resist, she stepped down. Days later, she was gone, a mortal again, no longer an emperor. But death could not erase her. The dynasty she had claimed ended, the Tang restored, scribes rushed to smear her name, but she had already carved herself into the stone of history. Because Wu Zetian ruled. She reigned with brilliance and brutality, with vision and violence. She fed millions, she terrified thousands, she bent the empire to her will. And in the echo of her rule, one truth lingers. She had been dismissed as impossible. A woman on the throne? Absurd. And yet she sat there, silk-wrapped, iron-fisted, her eyes on eternity. Wu Zetian's reign has stretched longer than anyone ever imagined. The little girl who once stood outside palace gates is now in her 70s, wrapped in silk, yes, but also in the weight of decades. Power is a heavy robe, and even emperors cannot outrun time. Her body began to fail first, illness creeping in, strength leaking away. Courtiers who once trembled at her presence now whispered behind folded sleeves, trading glances when her voice cracked, when her hands shook. The empire she had commanded with such ferocity started to look less like a machine and more like a stage, everyone waiting for the final curtain. Factions sharpened their knives. Her lovers, the Zhang brothers, were still by her side, pampered and proud, but they had become symbols of decay, of indulgence, of a court losing its edge. Ministers seethed. Generals muttered. Her sons, the very ones she had pushed aside, circled like wolves, smelling blood. The coup came in 705. Swift, quiet, and merciless. Officials stormed the palace. The Zhang brothers cut down, their heads rolling as proof that the spell was broken. Wu, too weak to resist, was forced to abdicate. The throne returned to her son, the Tang dynasty restored, as if her 20 years of rule had been a pause, a detour, a mistake to be corrected. And then, days later, she was gone. The daughter of a merchant, the concubine, the empress, the emperor, dead. Her burial was telling. She was laid to rest beside her husband, Emperor Gaozong, in a magnificent tomb at Qianling. But her stele, the great stone monument that should have shouted her legacy to the heavens, was left blank. No inscription, no record, just an empty slab. Her enemies wanted her story silent. They wanted history to forget. But history, inconveniently, does not forget so easily. Scribes condemned her, yes, painting her as a schemer, a poisoner, a temptress who had stolen what was not hers. Confucian scholars wrote her down as a warning, a scar on the empire. Her name became taboo. But beneath all the slander, the facts remained stubborn. She had ruled. She had expanded the exams, strengthened agriculture, built temples, enforced order. She had given power to men of talent over men of pedigree. She had outplayed rivals who thought her unworthy and walked into the dragon throne itself. No smear campaign could erase the sheer audacity of that. And over the centuries, the whispers shifted. Some began to see her not just as villain, but as visionary. Yes, she was ruthless, but so were most emperors. Yes, she silenced opposition, but so had dynasties before and after. The only difference? She had been a woman. Modern eyes look at Wu Zetian with curiosity, even admiration. She shattered the ceiling of her age, bending the empire to her will when everything was built to crush her. Was she cruel? But she was also brilliant, determined, and unforgettable. Her blank steel stands as irony itself. An emperor denied an epitaph, whose story became louder precisely because it was left unsaid. So, what do we do with Wu Zetian? Do we condemn her as a usurper, a butcher in silk? Or do we recognize her as a woman who refused to stay small, who grabbed the world's most dangerous throne and held it, against all odds? The answer, as always, is both. She was ruthless and radiant, terrifying and triumphant. She was human, wielding power in the only way power allows, with claws unsheathed. And in the end, her legacy lingers. Not in the blank stone, not in the slanders, but in the undeniable truth that, for 2 decades, the most powerful person in the world was Wu Zetian. A woman, an emperor, a name that could not be erased. Let's leave the palace shadows behind and step onto the road, not just any road, but the oldest kind of human invention that has almost never been celebrated, though it shaped every empire that ever rose, the road, the dusty, rutted, cracked line that pulled caravans across deserts, soldiers across continents, and ideas across centuries. Roads are strange things, aren't they? You hardly notice them until they're gone. Today you complain about potholes, but in the ancient world, the miracle was not that a road had bumps, it was that there was a road at all. Imagine Mesopotamia 4,000 years ago. The land between the rivers was a swampy, muddy, unpredictable patchwork. When the floods came, paths vanished. When the sun baked the earth, those same paths hardened into ruts deep enough to snap an axle. Merchants carrying lapis from Afghanistan or tin from Anatolia were forced to wrestle with mud that sucked at sandals and swallowed wagons. Yet even here, people began to lay the first primitive roads. Not smooth stone, not neat brick, but layers of reeds, clay, and crushed gravel packed down to keep carts from sinking. Simple, yes, but revolutionary. In Ur and Babylon, city planners realized something radical. If you paved the streets, you could control the city itself. Roads became a skeleton, guiding processions, armies, trade, and the daily shuffle of sandals. These were not roads for the people's convenience. No, they were for kings. Roads were statements, channels where a ruler's soldiers marched and where tribute flowed in. And from Mesopotamia, the idea spread. Then came Persia, and Persia was different. Under Darius the Great, around 500 BC, they built something that looked like magic, the Royal Road. Imagine this, a highway more than 1,500 miles long, stretching from Susa in the heart of Persia to Sardis near the Aegean. Stone, gravel, carefully engineered. Stations set every few miles with fresh horses, like a relay race of empire. A courier could leave one end and arrive at the other in under a week. A week, when without the road the same journey might take 3 months. Herodotus marveled at it, writing that neither snow nor rain, nor heat, nor gloom of night stays these couriers from the swift completion of their appointed rounds. Sound familiar? Yes, the U.S. Postal Service stole that line centuries later. Persia wrote the original rulebook for moving information. But the Royal Road wasn't just a courier track, it was the nervous system of an empire. Tax money, tribute, silk, spices, soldiers, even gossip flowed down it. When Darius wanted to stamp his power onto the world, he didn't just raise armies, he raised roads. Rome, of course, would take this to its extreme. Roman roads were not mere dirt packed underfoot, they were engineering marvels. The Via Appia, begun in 312 BC, stretched like a stone spear through the Italian countryside, its paving blocks still surviving today, harder than most of our modern asphalt. The Romans layered their roads, sand at the base, stone stacked tight above, gravel packed in, and then thick slabs of rock fitted so precisely you could hardly wedge a blade between them. They did not build these roads for merchants or wandering poets. No, Rome built them for war. Legions marched swiftly on them, supply wagons rolled without sinking, cavalry could thunder across provinces. The roads allowed Rome to conquer and to keep conquered. All roads lead to Rome, the saying goes, but that was not a metaphor, it was a fact. The roads radiated out like veins from the heart, tying the empire into one body. And here's the irony, the Romans built them for soldiers, but once they were there, roads changed everything else too. Farmers could bring surplus grain to cities. Traders could haul amphorae of wine, jars of olive oil, baskets of fruit, not to a nearby village, but across entire provinces. Ideas traveled, philosophy from Greece, mystery cults from the East, Christianity itself. Without the Roman roads, Paul the Apostle would never have wandered so far. Ideas need legs and legs need roads. But let's pause here because there is something poetic in the way roads work. You see, a road is always two things at once. It is a tool of control. Whoever owns the road controls the flow. But it is also a crack in control, a way for ideas, whispers, rebellions, even plagues to slip through. The same roads that let Rome send soldiers to crush revolts also let rebels spread word of uprising faster than ever before. The same Persian Royal Road that brought taxes to Susa also carried rumors from Sardis. Roads are never neutral. And they were dangerous too. Let's not romanticize it. Ancient roads did not come with police patrols or rest stops with free Wi-Fi. They came with brigands, wolves, weather, thirst. A lone traveler could vanish into a ditch and never be seen again. Entire caravans might be ambushed, stripped bare, left for the vultures. To walk a road was to gamble, with fortune, with thieves, with fate. And yet, people kept building them, kept walking them, because the rewards outweighed the risk. Every empire understood, no roads, no rule. No roads, no riches. So, picture this. A Persian courier pounding hooves into the dirt, the king's message clutched in his hand. A Roman legion, shields glinting, dust rising behind them as they marched toward another frontier. A merchant caravan hauling silk from China, crossing deserts where the road is little more than a memory of where others walked before. A medieval pilgrim, staff in hand, trudging towards Santiago or Rome. All of them, bound by the same truth, the road made their journey possible. Roads did not just connect places. They connected time. They connected strangers. They created what we call civilization. And yet, for all their glory, roads also tell you where empires end. Where the road stops, so does the empire. Beyond the stone, the gravel, the beaten dirt, wilderness, chaos, the unknown. Roads were a way of saying, here is order, here is law, here is where we claim the world. And beyond? That belongs to someone else. So, the next time you walk across a cracked sidewalk or curse traffic on the highway, remember this: you are standing in a tradition older than any king, older than any empire. Roads are not just stone and dust. They are memory. They are empire made visible. They are the oldest promise humanity ever made to itself. If we lay a path, we can move together. And perhaps the most haunting thought is this: every road is built with a direction in mind, but once built, it never belongs only to its maker. Persian kings, Roman emperors, medieval dukes, all thought their roads eternal. Yet their stones now lie in ruins, while new feet walk them, new empires rise, new names replace the old. The road endures, even when the builder's name is dust. So maybe, in the end, it is not the kings or the generals who rule history, it is the roads. The Silk Road, even the name feels like a whisper of romance, like a caravan bell jingling in the distance. But the truth is more complicated, more dusty, more dangerous. Because the Silk Road was never a single road at all. It was a tangle, a shifting web of routes and tracks, from China through Central Asia, over deserts, past mountains, spilling west into Persia, the Levant, and finally Europe. It was less of a paved highway and more of a living organism, veins pulsing with trade, ambition, and rumor. Why silk? Because silk was the superstar of the East. Light, smooth, luminous, it caught the sun like liquid. The Chinese guarded its secret fiercely. Legend has it, anyone caught smuggling silkworms faced death. For centuries, only China knew the art, unwinding cocoons, spinning threads finer than human hair, weaving shimmering cloth. Romans couldn't get enough of it. Senators draped themselves in it, and moralists fumed. One writer complained that silk was corrupting Rome, making men effeminate, women too alluring. Yet the demand only grew. Gold and silver poured eastward, while bolts of silk flowed west. But silk was only one current in a river of goods. Caravans hauled spices, cinnamon, cloves, pepper, cardamom, so valuable they were weighed against gold. Ivory, jade, coral, pearls, paper, glass, and wine shuffled across the continent, changing hands 100 times. But it wasn't just luxuries. Horses from the steppes thundered eastward, war elephants ambled west. Merchants carried furs, hides, wool, even humble grain. If it could be moved, it was. And along with goods came ideas. That was the real power of the Silk Road. Buddhism, born in India, marched north with monks, spreading into Central Asia and China. Islam traveled east, reshaping cities like Samarkand and Bokhara into jewels of mosques and minarets. Christianity, too, hitched a ride, carried by Nestorian missionaries into lands the Romans never dreamed of. Even inventions, paper, gunpowder, compasses, slipped quietly down these dusty tracks, changing the world in ways armies never could. But travel was not easy. Caravans faced deserts that burned by day and froze by night. The Taklamakan, whose name chillingly means you go in but you don't come out, swallowed entire expeditions. Bandits prowled mountain passes, demanding tolls with swords in hand. Storms swept across the steppes without warning, wiping away both man and beast. And disease, silent, invisible, rode the same paths. The Silk Road was the highway of the Black Death in the 14th century, fleas and rats spreading faster than any caravan. So who traveled these roads? Not emperors, not kings. It was merchants, muleteers, camel drivers, monks, pilgrims, mercenaries, adventurers, and sometimes fools. Marco Polo, for example, whose tales are half truth, half dream. Whether he saw everything he claimed or not, he became a symbol of the road's lure, the promise that beyond the horizon lay wonders unimaginable. The cities along the Silk Road glittered like mirages. Samarkand, oasis of blue domes and tiled walls, where markets overflowed with goods from 3 continents. Kashgar, crossroads of cultures, where Persian poets rubbed shoulders with Chinese traders. Palmyra, a desert jewel, a caravan city where Rome's influence kissed the sands of Syria. These cities thrived on trade, fattened by the tolls they charged. Caravans might hate paying, but without these oases, there was only death. And what of the road's politics? Every empire wanted to control it. Persians, Greeks, Kushans, Turks, Mongols, all knew that to own the Silk Road was to own the arteries of wealth. Genghis Khan's heirs, in particular, made the road safer than it had ever been. Under the Pax Mongolica, a merchant could ride from Venice to Beijing with a relative sense of security. It was brutal order, yes, built on conquest, fear, and blood, but for a brief century, the world seemed smaller. And here's the irony. For all its glamour, the Silk Road was not constant. Wars, plagues, shifting deserts, all could close routes overnight. Traders adapted, moved south to sea lanes, or north through steppes. The road was never one line. It was a dance, changing with each century. And eventually, it faded. By the 16th century, European ships had open sea routes that bypassed it entirely. The camel bells grew quiet. The oases emptied. The Silk Road crumbled into history. Yet, its ghost remains. Every highway, every internet cable, every shipping route today is just another Silk Road, another thread tying distant people together. Globalization is not new. It is old, older than Rome, older than China. It is as old as the caravan moving slowly, painfully, across a desert, bearing silk and spice and stories. So when you hear the phrase Silk Road, don't picture a single path. Picture instead a web stretched across half the earth, sticky with wealth and danger, shimmering with hope. A web that caught kings and peasants alike. A web that held the world together, until the world shifted and left it behind. The road may be dust now, but its echo is everywhere. The medieval pilgrim roads, because not every road was about money or empires. Some were about faith, about fear, about the eternal gamble that maybe, just maybe, walking across half a continent with blisters and lice would buy you a seat in heaven. Picture it. Europe in the Middle Ages. Muddy tracks winding through forests, fields, and villages. Not paved, not grand. These weren't Roman highways anymore. Rome had crumbled, and so had its roads. Instead, what you got were rutted paths, barely wide enough for a cart, choking with dust in summer, drowning in muck in winter. Yet people walked them. Millions of them, over centuries. Pilgrimage was the craze. You sinned? Join the line. You wanted a miracle? Tie up your shoes. You wanted penance for your brother, your father, or maybe your neighbor's donkey. Pack a sack and start walking. The greatest routes became famous, almost legendary. There was the Camino de Santiago, stretching across Spain to the shrine of St. James, where pilgrims trudged through mountains and plains until they could collapse in front of the cathedral. There was Canterbury in England, made immortal by Chaucer's stories, each tale told to pass the miles. There was Rome itself, the eternal city, where the relics of martyrs and the tombs of saints promised blessings. And there was Jerusalem, the ultimate goal, though the most dangerous. Now, don't imagine quiet, holy processions. These roads were chaos. Peasants in patch tunics walked beside knights in chainmail. Beggars limped alongside bishops. Thieves prowled the routes, because where else could you find easy prey but among exhausted, half-starved travelers carrying coins tucked in their belts? Inns popped up along the way, some run by monks, others by opportunists who saw piety as just another market. And relics, oh, relics were the fuel of it all. Shriveled fingers of saints, splinters of the true cross, holy vials of suspicious-looking blood. You could walk 100 miles just to kiss a bone fragment behind glass. Cynical? Maybe. But for the medieval mind, these objects were ladders to heaven. The journey itself was ordeal. Feet bled. Shoes rotted. Travelers froze in mountain passes or drowned in rivers. They begged for food in strange towns where no one spoke their dialect. Sickness spread quickly, dysentery, fevers, plague. For women, the danger was doubled. Harassment, assault, vulnerability on roads where law was thin and violence thick. And yet they kept walking, because the road was more than punishment. It was community. Strangers met, traded stories, sang songs, prayed together. A tinker from France could share bread with a mason from England, and both would swear that the shrine ahead held their salvation. They formed bands for safety, moving in groups so that wolves, both four-legged and two, would hesitate. And of course, the church encouraged it. Pilgrimages were spiritual revenue streams. Towns that had a shrine flourished. Bakers sold loaves, inns filled beds, markets buzzed with the chatter of foreign tongues. A holy site meant business, and a road to that holy site was the artery pumping wealth into its heart. The Crusades themselves can be seen as an extension of pilgrimage, a march, but armed, toward Jerusalem. For many, it was just a very dangerous, very bloody road trip under divine branding. Some pilgrims returned home transformed, humbled, penitent, with stories of miracles. Others returned broken, bankrupt, or never returned at all. Yet their footprints reshaped Europe. They reconnected towns, revived the old Roman tracks, and knitted together a fractured continent. These muddy pilgrim roads became the ghostly scaffolding of future highways. So, what was it like to be on one? Imagine trudging mile after mile, your stomach empty, your back aching, but your eyes fixed on a distant steeple. Imagine muttering prayers through cracked lips, clutching your walking stick, while beside you a stranger sings a hymn you barely understand. Imagine sleeping in barns, in fields, under dripping eaves, only to rise at dawn and walk again. Worth it? If you believed salvation was priceless. And if you didn't? Well, at least you got a decent story, and maybe a patch of cloth stitched with the emblem of the shrine, proof you'd made it. In the end, medieval pilgrimage roads were less about geography and more about humanity, our need to move, to hope, to hurt, and to believe that suffering leads somewhere better. They were highways of faith, but also of fraud, of friendship, of fear. Muddy, dangerous, miraculous, they stitched together a continent that desperately needed direction. And for every weary traveler, the road was both punishment and promise. Imagine walking through the dust of ancient India, the air thick with the scent of spices, smoke, and sweat. Kingdoms rose and fell here like tides, but the roads, those long, patient lines carved across the land, tied everything together. They were arteries, pulsing with pilgrims, merchants, soldiers, elephants, ox carts, wandering monks, and kings. Ashoka, the Mauryan emperor of the 3rd century BC, understood this better than most. After the bloodbath of Kalinga broke him, he turned to Buddhism, and his empire followed. And what does a repentant conqueror do? He builds roads, Not just for armies now, but for pilgrims, for ideas, for Dharma itself. He ordered highways cut through forests and fields, lined them with banyan trees for shade, dug wells at intervals so travelers wouldn't die of thirst, built rest houses, carved waymarkers. Merciless, but also power. Because a good road is a king's shadow, stretching far beyond his throne. Merchants loved it. Caravans stacked with pepper, cinnamon, ginger, and turmeric, treasures that would later set European mouths watering, creaked along those roads. Ivory tusks gleamed on carts, cotton textiles folded in bundles, beads and gems clinking in sacks. The road to the northwest tied India to Persia, to Bactria, to the wider world. The road east carried goods to the Bay of Bengal, to ships that sailed to Southeast Asia. Trade became faith's twin, each borrowing the other's sandals. And faith, oh, faith ran faster than spice. Buddhist monks set out along these roads, begging bowls in hand, walking barefoot through dust and monsoon rain. They stopped at villages, preached under trees, carried scrolls, stories, sutras. From these roads, Buddhism leapt out of India, spreading north to Central Asia, to China, to Japan. Hinduism too traveled, its gods crossing frontiers on the lips of merchants. Jain monks followed, austere and silent, reminding the world that even the smallest insect mattered. The road was not just dirt. It was scripture, spoken by feet. And the roads were more than spiritual lifelines. They were also strategic ones. Armies thundered down them, elephants armored, chariots rattling, infantry raising clouds of dust. A kingdom with a road could strike swiftly, send its soldiers where needed, control rebellion, display dominance. For the ruler, the road was both a gift and a leash. But don't romanticize. These weren't smooth Roman highways with stone layers. Most were packed dirt, sometimes gravel, sometimes little more than widened tracks. Rains turned them to rivers of mud. Dry seasons cracked them like old skin. Travelers suffered, heat stroke, disease, bandits in forests, snakes in tall grass. Oxen collapsed, carts broke, and still the road stretched on, endless. Yet through that hardship, cultures mingled. Greek ambassadors after Alexander's campaigns walked India's roads. Chinese monks centuries later followed them, like Faxian and Xuanzang, braving deserts and jungles to fetch scriptures. Each left writings, marveling at the scale, the bustle, the strange mix of cruelty and generosity they met along the way. Over time, other rulers added their own touches. The Guptas maintained networks, linking cities of science and art. Medieval dynasties extended routes for temple pilgrimages, to Varanasi, to Puri, to Madurai. Roads became holy lines, drawn not just by kings but by faith itself. Thousands of pilgrims walked barefoot toward shrines, chanting, carrying offerings, sleeping by roadside shrines that grew like mushrooms along the way. And here's the thing. India's roads were less about straight lines and more about living connections. They weren't just infrastructure. They were marketplaces, festivals, theaters. You could see jugglers performing by a banyan, hear a poet reciting to a crowd of traders, stumble upon a wedding procession blocking the path. The road was a stage, every traveler both audience and actor. Centuries later, when the Delhi Sultans and then the Mughals ruled, roads thickened again. Sher Shah Suri in the 16th century laid the Great Grand Trunk Road, stretching thousands of kilometers, from Bengal through Delhi all the way to Kabul. Milestones marked every coast, rest houses called sarais dotted the way. It was an empire's backbone, carrying tax revenue, soldiers, silk, spices, rumors, edicts. And like Ashoka before him, Sher Shah knew, build the road, and the people will follow. So what was it like to be a traveler? Imagine the sound first, bells on bullocks, wheels creaking, hawkers shouting, monks chanting. Imagine the smell, sweat, dung, incense, frying cakes at a roadside stall. Imagine the sight, dust rising in swirls, columns of soldiers marching, pilgrims bowing, elephants lumbering, their tusks painted red. Danger always near, but life surging all around. In the end, India's roads were less about stone and dirt and more about connection. They tied together kingdoms, villages, shrines, ports, rivers, seas. They carried faiths that reshaped half the world, goods that flavored continents, ideas that leapt oceans. They were rough, yes, muddy, uneven, but they were alive. And every footprint pressed into their dust, whether of king, monk, merchant, or beggar, became part of the long rhythm of India itself. In the ancient world, a road was never just dirt beneath your feet. It was promise, power, punishment. Rome carved theirs in stone, straight lines across Europe, a reminder that the empire never zigged when it could march. Persia's royal road stretched like a bowstring, relay riders galloping faster than rumor. China's roads, muddy but endless, fed the dragon of bureaucracy, carrying taxes, troops, whispers. The Incas wove their Kapaknan through mountains without wheels, rope bridges swaying like spider silk between cliffs. India shaded her highways with banyan trees, wells dug by kings and pilgrims alike. And medieval Europe stitched its faith together with pilgrim paths, muddy veins leading to shrines and relics, salvation promised for every blister. Roads were veins, and empires the beating hearts. But veins clot, and hearts stop. Rome fell, its roads crumbled, yet the traces remain, ghostly scars on fields. The Persian couriers are gone, but the line is still there, buried. The Silk Road faded, caravans silenced, yet its echo lives in every cargo ship, every internet cable. The pilgrim roads of Europe are tourist trails now, boots and backpacks where once there were bare feet and prayers. Because roads never really die. They are memory made visible. Every track carved by hooves, wheels, sandals, is a story pressed into soil. Roads tell us that humanity is restless, that we are always moving, toward gods, toward gold, toward each other. And here's the final irony. We began with China, where one day in the empire could crush you with bows and taxes. We passed through famine in the Sierra Nevada, through Wu Zetian's silk-wrapped claws, through deserts, temples, shrines. And now we end with this, a road. A line in the dust, stretching both backward and forward. The ancients knew it, and so do we. To build a road is to say, we are here and we are going somewhere. So, next time you drive a highway or scroll through a glowing screen, remember, you are on a road. And behind you, stretching across centuries, are countless others, walked by emperors and peasants, saints and thieves, soldiers and fools. Roads are the story of humanity itself. And in their dust, you can still hear the footsteps,